The HOA thought they could build 15 commercial buildings on my private island. Too bad for them, they walked right into my perfect legal trap. I watched as the HOA president, Becky, stood there with a smug look, telling me the sanctuary I built for my late wife was now a community project. They were pouring concrete over her memorial garden when I found it. But while they were busy stealing my land, they never bothered to check the fine print. They had no idea that every single pipe they laid was activating a hidden clause in my deed. A clause that was about to make me their landlord and them my bankrupt tenants. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, because this takedown is absolutely brutal. And if you believe no HOA has the right to treat homeowners like dirt, hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment their fake power comes crashing down. The best part of the day on my island is the 5 minutes just before sunrise. The air off the Gulf is cool and smells like salt and clean sand. The gulls are just starting to wake up, making these lazy, stretching calls to one another. From the dock, I can see the lights on the mainland twinkling out one by one as the sky gets brighter. This isn't some natural paradise someone stumbled upon. I built this place. Every piling driven into the seabed, every board on the dock, every single bag of concrete for the foundation of the little cottage. I did it all with my own 2 hands. 25 years of weekends and savings went into reclaiming this little patch of land from the sea. It was my project after I retired from the Navy. My way of staying busy after my wife, Eleanor, passed away. She always dreamed of a little house right on the water, where she could watch the dolphins. She never got to see it finished, but I named it Eleanor's Point in her memory. It's not just land, it's a promise I kept. My daughter Emily plans to live out here when she retires from nursing. It was supposed to be our family's sanctuary, a quiet corner of the world that belonged only to us, a place of peace. I'd just spent 3 days up north with Emily and her family. We had a great time, but I was eager to get back home, back to the quiet. I turned off the main road onto my private access drive, a half-mile of packed gravel that leads to the causeway connecting my home to the island. The first thing I saw was a big muddy pickup truck I didn't recognize parked near my gate. Strange, but I figured it was a lost delivery driver. Then I saw another one, and then, as I rounded the last bend, my heart dropped into my stomach. My causeway, the one I spent a year stabilizing with riprap and reinforced concrete, looked like an industrial park. There were huge pieces of construction equipment everywhere. A backhoe, a cement mixer, stacks of lumber and steel beams. Temporary office trailers sat on the patch of grass where Emily and I had picnics, their generators humming and spewing diesel fumes into the clean air. And on every single piece of equipment, on the side of every trailer, was a logo I knew all too well, the smug, stylized eagle of the Oak Harbor Homeowners Association. Sprawled across my beautiful private island were the skeletal frames of 15 identical buildings, a scar of raw lumber and concrete on the landscape I had so carefully built. I put my truck in park and got out, my legs feeling unsteady. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a clipboard spotted me immediately. It was Becky Cranston, the HOA president. She marched over like she was invading a foreign country, a smug little smile playing on her lips. Behind her, a beefy guy in a cheap security uniform stood with his arms crossed. He had a badge on his shirt that looked like it came from a cereal box. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake politeness. I kept my own voice level. Years as an engineer in the Navy taught me you don't solve problems by shouting. "You can start by telling me what all this is," I said, gesturing to the chaos. "This is private property." She laughed, not a friendly laugh, but a short, sharp bark. "Not anymore, Mr. Mercer. This land was legally annexed by the Association for our new community waterfront project. It's for mixed-use commercial units, very upscale." I just stared at her. Annexed? This island wasn't even part of the original subdivision. I bought the land and the access rights 10 years before the HOA even existed. It had its own deed, its own parcel number, and I paid a separate hefty property tax bill on it every single year. "I think there's been a mistake," I said, trying to hold on to my patience. "I have the deed. This land has never been part of the HOA." She waved her clipboard dismissively, a sheaf of papers rustling. The board voted. We filed the revised zoning maps with the county. It's all perfectly legal. Your deed is outdated. Due to shared environmental zoning, we have full jurisdiction. Her husband, Ethan Cranston, a slick developer I'd seen around town, stepped out of one of the trailers. He didn't say a word, just gave me a little nod and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was enjoying this. Becky tapped her pen on her clipboard. "You're welcome to review the paperwork at the next board meeting, but frankly, you're interfering with a sanctioned community development. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're being non-compliant." Non-compliant. The word hung in the air, a tidy little label meant to shut me up. She was treating me like a tenant who was late with rent, not a man standing on the ground he literally created. I looked past her, at the raw frames of the buildings. One of them was right on top of the little memorial garden I'd planted for Eleanor. They were building over my wife's memory. I didn't say another word. There was no point. You can't reason with a wall. I got back in my truck, the smell of sawdust and exhaust filling my lungs, and turned it around. My mind was racing, trying to process the sheer audacity of it. They didn't just trespass, they had a whole story cooked up, complete with paperwork. They had planned this. I drove the half-mile back to my gate, the one on the mainland that marks the start of my property. As I pulled up, I saw a flash of color that wasn't there when I left. Tacked crudely to the solid oak gate my daughter had helped me build was a piece of bright orange paper. I got out, my hands shaking slightly, and pulled it free. It was a formal notice, printed in bold black letters under the HOA's eagle logo. At the top, it said, "Notice of Access Revocation." Below, in cold bureaucratic language, it informed me that, due to my failure to comply with community development directives, my access rights to the causeway and island had been revoked, effective immediately. Any attempt to enter would be considered trespassing. The island I had poured my life into, the home that held my heart, was no longer mine to even set foot on. They hadn't just stolen it. They had locked me out. My first instinct was to call a lawyer, but I knew what that meant. Months, maybe years, of expensive arguments while they kept right on building. The system is slow. Becky and her husband were counting on that. They were counting on me getting tired, running out of money, and just giving up. I wasn't going to play their game. I was going to play mine. I spent 30 years as a Navy engineer. You don't solve a structural problem by yelling at it. You find the weakness, you analyze the stress points, and you apply precise pressure until it fails. So I decided to start by doing it their way, by the book, just to see how rigged the whole system was. The HOA had a special meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday. The agenda was a single line item, Community Waterfront Project Update. It was a joke, a performance for the other homeowners who had no idea what was really going on. I put on a clean-collared shirt, gathered my original deed, the county tax records, and the survey maps showing my property lines, and I walked into that community hall ready to calmly and logically explain their error. The room smelled like stale coffee and air freshener. Becky was sitting at the head of a long table, gavel in hand, flanked by 4 other board members who looked either bored or terrified. Her husband, Ethan, sat in the front row, looking relaxed in a golf shirt. I waited patiently through the first 15 minutes of nonsense about lawn ornaments and trash can placement. When Becky finally called my name, I walked to the podium and laid out my documents. I spoke clearly and calmly. I explained that Eleanor's Point was never part of the Oak Harbor development. I showed them the deed, signed and sealed 3 decades ago. I showed them the tax bills I paid directly to the county, proving it was a separate parcel. I pointed to the official county map, where a thick, unambiguous line separated my land from theirs. For a moment, there was silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, I had gotten through to them. Then Becky picked up her gavel and tapped it lightly. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice filled with a kind of pitying condescension. "But as we explained, your paperwork is outdated. The board voted to incorporate the parcel under a shared environmental zoning ordinance for the good of the entire community. It's about progress." A man on the board, a fidgety guy named Arthur, mumbled something about overriding community interests. They had their script, and they were sticking to it. They dismissed my life's work with a few buzzwords. The other homeowners in the audience just looked down at their feet. No one wanted to get on Becky's bad side. As the meeting was breaking up, one of the board members, a quiet man named Frank, pulled me aside. "Look," he whispered, avoiding my eyes. "She's got them all wrapped around her finger, but you can file a formal appeal. There's a process. Put it all in writing. They have to review it. It felt like a sliver of light in a dark room. False hope, it turned out, is the cruelest kind. I spent the next 4 days chained to my desk. I wrote up a detailed 14-page appeal. I included copies of every document. I cross-referenced parcel numbers and zoning codes. I even attached photographs of the island from every year since I bought it. It was an open and shut case, presented with the kind of precision that would make a regulator weep. I hand-delivered it to the HOA management office and got a signed receipt. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. The construction on my island didn't slow down. If anything, it sped up. The noise of nail guns and heavy machinery echoed across the water from sunup to sundown. Then, a certified letter arrived. I thought it was their response. It wasn't. It was a formal notice of a $500 fine for unauthorized interference with construction equipment, backdated to the day I'd first confronted Becky. The letter stated my appeal had been lost in processing, and that the deadline to refile had passed. The next day I got a call from Frank, the board member who'd seemed sympathetic. He told me he was resigning, effective immediately. "I'm sorry, Jack," he said, his voice weak. "I've got a family. I can't be a part of this." And just like that, the door slammed shut. That night, I couldn't sleep. The moon was bright, and I could see the silhouettes of the half-built structures against the sky. I walked down to the edge of the water, as close as I could get to my island without trespassing on my own land. The familiar sounds of the night, the gentle lapping of waves, the chirp of crickets, were gone. Instead, there was the constant low hum of generators and the harsh glare of temporary floodlights. I could hear men's voices shouting over the noise, strangers on my sanctuary, dust and the smell of raw. Pine hung in the air. This wasn't my home anymore. It was a construction site. It was a violation. I felt a wave of despair so heavy it almost buckled my knees. Emily had been begging me to sell, to just take what they offered and walk away before I lost everything. For a moment I considered it. I was tired. I was a 62-year-old man fighting a machine. But as I stood there, a flicker of movement from a large shipping container near the causeway caught my eye. A work light illuminated the logo on its side. It wasn't the HOA Eagle. It was a sleek, modern design with 2 letters, CD, Cranston Development LLC, Becky's husband's company. It hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just an HOA power trip. This was a calculated business deal wrapped in the legal authority of the Homeowners Association. They weren't building a community waterfront project. They were using the HOA as a legal crowbar to pry my land away from me, so Ethan Cranston could build commercial properties and sell them for a massive profit. A cold, hard clarity settled over me, pushing the despair away. The rage was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer hot and helpless. It was cold. It was quiet. It was the feeling an engineer gets right before he sits down at his drafting table. They didn't just steal my land. They were flipping it for a fortune. And in that moment, standing in the dark, I stopped thinking about appeals and started drawing up a different kind of plan. They had walked right into my world, the world of permits and schematics and infrastructure. They just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I traded my anger for a spiral notebook and a fresh pack of pens. Becky Cranston fought with meetings and paperwork. I was going to beat her with her own weapons. My first stop was the county clerk's office, a dreary building downtown, with fluorescent lights that hummed and floors that smelled of old paper and cleaning solution. I asked the clerk for the plat maps for Oak Harbor, sections A, B, and the new proposed C. She slid a heavy binder across the counter. I spent 3 hours hunched over those pages, tracing lines with my finger, cross-referencing dates, and taking photos of every relevant document with my phone. And there it was, filed just 6 months ago, a revised zoning map. My island, Eleanor's Point, had been crudely redrawn and absorbed into a new parcel labeled Community Parcel C. The forgery was amateur at best. The lines were slightly thicker, the lettering didn't quite match. But it had a stamp. It had a signature. It looked official enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking closely. That stamp was the key. They had committed fraud, and they had gotten a government office to validate it. My next stops were the tax assessor and the Coastal Commission, where I found more of the same, a neat, orderly paper trail documenting a crime. While I was busy waging my quiet paper war, the HOA was escalating its ground war. The harassment became a part of my daily routine. Another fine showed up in my mailbox, this one for an unmaintained entryway, referring to the gate they had locked me out of. It was for $1,000. A few days later, I came out to find my truck, which was parked in its usual spot in my own driveway on the mainland, had been towed. The notice left behind cited a violation of an obscure HOA bylaw about commercial vehicles parked in residential view. I drove a standard Ford F-150. It was petty, designed to wear me down, to bleed me dry one bogus fine at a time. Neighbors who used to wave now looked the other way. Rumors started to spread that I was some kind of illegal squatter, a crazy old man causing trouble for the community. Becky's propaganda machine was in full swing, but every fine, every tow, every whispered rumor just hardened my resolve. They thought they were controlling me, but they were just giving me more evidence. I photographed every notice, saved every receipt, and documented every single interaction in my notebook. My real breakthrough came not from the land records, but from the utility permits. As a builder, it's second nature for me to think about what lies beneath the ground. You can't just erect 15 commercial buildings without water, sewer, and power. That infrastructure has to come from somewhere. I went to the county utilities department and pulled the permits Cranston Development had filed for the project. My engineering background made the schematics easy to read. I traced the proposed lines for freshwater intake, wastewater outflow, and the main electrical conduit. My heart started beating a little faster. Every single one of them, the power, the water, the sewer, ran from the mainland, across my causeway, and onto my island. They had to cross my property to service their illegal construction. They were building their entire project on a foundation of my private infrastructure. The main water valve for the entire island was located 10 feet inside my property line on the mainland side. The master electrical junction box was bolted to a concrete slab I had poured myself, right next to my gate. They were building a commercial development and powering it using my service lines, my connections, my easement. That afternoon, I started a new kind of survey. I took hundreds of time-stamped photographs. I documented the exact location of every connection point, every valve, every meter. I drew up my own private schematic, a detailed map of their trespassing. Every flush of a toilet in their temporary trailers, every light they switched on, was a fresh violation. They were so arrogant, so sure of their power, that they never even considered the pipes and wires under their feet. They saw the land, but they were blind to the systems that made it work. This was my world, a world of flow rates and load calculations, and they had blundered into it like amateurs. The final piece of the puzzle came into place when I decided to visit an old friend. Maria Ortiz had been a county surveyor for nearly 30 years. We'd worked together on a few projects back when I was still building houses. She was sharp, honest, and one of the few people I knew who loved the clean, factual truth of a survey line as much as I did. I found her in her small, cluttered office, surrounded by rolled-up maps and technical manuals. I laid out the original plat map and the HOA's fraudulent revision side by side on her desk. I didn't say much, just pointed. She put on her reading glasses and leaned in close, tracing the lines with a pen. She pulled out a magnifying glass, studying the stamps, the signatures. She was silent for a long time, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, she sat back in her chair and took off her glasses, polishing them slowly with a cloth. She looked at me, and her expression wasn't just concerned, it was grave. "Jack," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The forged map is bad. That's a felony. But it's more than that." She tapped the pile of utility permits and the Cranston Development LLC filings I'd brought. Using a fraudulent document to secure permits, using the HOA as a front to seize private land for a commercial enterprise run by a board member's husband. This isn't just fraud. She met my eyes, and the look on her face confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. This is racketeering. The word hung in the air between us. It was a heavy word, a dangerous word, but it was also a powerful one. It meant this was no longer a simple property dispute. We had moved into the territory of organized crime, and I finally had a name for what I was fighting. Knowing you're right and proving it are two very different things. Maria's confirmation that this was racketeering felt like a victory, but it was a lonely one. In the weeks that followed, the pressure from the HOA became relentless. The construction didn't just continue, it accelerated. Trucks came and went at all hours, kicking up dust that coated my windows and soured the air. The bogus fines kept coming, piling up on my kitchen table like a monument to their corruption. Then came the official-looking letter from the HOA's legal firm. They had placed a lien on my home, not the island, but my actual house on the mainland, for unpaid community development dues and fines totaling over $20,000. They were leveraging the property I owned, free and clear to pay for the development they were illegally building on land they had stolen from me. It was a bold, vicious move, designed to corner me completely. My daughter Emily was beside herself with worry. She came over one evening, her face etched with concern. "Dad, please," she said, her voice strained. "Just sell it. Let them have it. It's not worth this. They're gonna take everything." I could see the toll it was taking on her. She's a trauma nurse. Her whole life is about fixing things. And here was a problem she couldn't solve, a wound she couldn't stitch up. I saw the logic in her words. I was tired. I was 62 years old and spending my retirement funds fighting a corrupt bureaucracy. The fight was draining me, isolating me from my neighbors and stressing my family. For a brief, dark moment, I nearly agreed. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to just walk away, to find peace somewhere else. The next afternoon, I drove down to the end of my access road, planning to take one last look at the island before calling a realtor. It was a kind of surrender. I parked and walked to the chain-link fence they had erected, the one plastered with "no trespassing" signs. I just wanted to see the sunrise spot on the dock one last time, to say a final, silent goodbye to Eleanor's garden. But what I saw sent a surge of white-hot anger through me that burned away all thoughts of surrender. A crew of workers was operating a small trencher. They were digging a deep channel right through the middle of the memorial garden. The rose bushes Eleanor had loved, the stone bench where we used to sit, they were gone, churned into a pile of mud and debris. They weren't just building over it anymore. They were ripping it out of the ground. That was it. That was the line. They could have the land, they could have the money, but they could not have that. That memory was sacred. In their greed, they had dug too deep. They had trespassed on something more than property, and in doing so, they gave me back my resolve. I turned away from the fence and walked back to my truck, my mind clear and sharp for the first time in weeks. I wasn't going to surrender. I was going to dismantle them. Back in my study, surrounded by deeds and schematics, I pulled out the oldest document of all, the original title from when I first bought the raw, undeveloped land 30 years ago. I'd read it a dozen times, but now I was looking for something different. I wasn't looking for proof of ownership. I was looking for a weapon. And there it was, tucked away in the dense legal language of an addendum, a small clause I'd insisted my lawyer include all those years ago. It was a retained utilities and access covenant. In plain English, it meant that while I owned the land outright, I also specifically retained personal ownership and jurisdiction over any and all utility infrastructure that serviced it. Water, power, sewer, the pipes and wires themselves belonged to me, personally. The clause went on to state that any third party wishing to utilize this infrastructure for any purpose, especially commercial, would be required to enter into a formal lease agreement. The rates were to be set at the prevailing commercial utility scale, retroactively, from the first day of use. My heart pounded against my ribs. It was perfect. They had been so focused on stealing the land, the big prize, that they had completely ignored the arteries that gave it life. And I owned the arteries. My next move had to be fast and quiet. The following morning, I went online and found a small local LLC for sale, a defunct landscaping company that was already registered with the state. I bought it for $1. An hour and a few online forms later, I had filed the official paperwork to change its name. It was now Mercer Island Utilities, LLC. My final step was a trip to the county recorder's office. I filed a notarized notice of jurisdiction, officially assigning all rights and responsibilities for the infrastructure detailed in my original title covenant to my new utility company. It was all by the book, all perfectly legal. The last piece was a formal letter, which I drafted myself and had delivered by courier to the primary contractor on the island, with a copy sent to the HOA. It was short and to the point. It stated, effective immediately, all usage of power, water, or sewer lines across the private easement servicing Parcel 4B, known as Mercer Island, now falls under the exclusive jurisdiction of Mercer Island Utilities, LLC. All existing connections are unauthorized. Please contact us to discuss lease terms and settlement of outstanding usage fees. I went to bed that night feeling a deep, calm certainty. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to flip the switch. The next day, when the construction crews showed up for work, they discovered their water pumps were dry, their power tools wouldn't turn on, the portable toilets wouldn't flush. The island had gone dark. The chaos started around 7:30 a.m. From my kitchen window, I could see the construction site across the water in a state of confused paralysis. Workers were standing around in clumps, shrugging, checking their phones. A few of them were kicking at the silent generators. My own phone rang an hour later. It was Becky Cranston. Her voice, usually so controlled and imperious, was sharp and frantic. "Mercer, what have you done? The contractors are saying the water and power are out. This is a sanctioned community project. You are legally obligated to restore service immediately." I let a few seconds of silence hang in the air before I answered, keeping my tone perfectly calm and professional, as if I were a customer service representative for a legitimate company. "Good morning, Mrs. Cranston. This is Jack Mercer, acting president of Mercer Island Utilities. I assume you're calling about the interruption of services to the Cranston development site." There was a sputtering on the other end of the line. "What in the world are you talking about? Mercer Island Utilities? What is that?" I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she tried to process it. "We are the registered utility provider for the infrastructure servicing that parcel," I explained patiently. "Service was suspended due to unauthorized use. I'd be happy to discuss restoring it once we've settled on a formal lease agreement and back payment for the services you've already consumed." I heard her take a sharp breath. "A lease agreement? That's absurd. We have jurisdiction." I almost smiled. "That's a land issue for the HOA to sort out," I said, my voice still level. "I'm just a humble utility man. My jurisdiction is limited to the pipes and wires. Now, based on standard commercial rates for a project of this scale, our initial invoice for past usage comes to, let me see." I rustled a piece of paper for effect. 83 days of unauthorized connection. The daily lease rate moving forward will be $14,200. Payable in advance, of course. The silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I think she actually dropped the phone. The beautiful part was its simplicity. I hadn't broken a single law. I hadn't trespassed. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I had simply exercised my legal rights as the owner of the infrastructure they were illegally using. The project ground to a dead halt. The next day, the contractors, who were being paid by the hour to do nothing, walked off the job. Their contract, after all, was with Cranston Development, not the HOA, and they weren't getting paid to sit in the dark. That's when the story broke. A local news reporter, probably tipped off by a disgruntled worker, showed up with a camera crew. By evening, the site of a half-finished, abandoned construction site on a private island was the lead story. Becky Cranston, forced into the spotlight, held a disastrous press conference right there at my gate. Standing in front of the no trespassing signs, she looked flustered and angry. She blamed a single rogue resident for sabotaging a vital community project out of selfish spite. She painted me as an obstructionist, a troublemaker holding the entire neighborhood hostage. She waved her fraudulent plat maps at the camera and talked about progress and the greater good. I waited until she was finished. Then, while the cameras were still rolling, I walked out of my house holding a single manila folder. The reporters swarmed me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I just calmly handed each of them a packet of documents. Inside was a copy of my original deed with the utility covenant highlighted, the notarized filing for Mercer Island Utilities LLC, and the official registration with the county recorder. I explained it in the simplest terms I could. "The land dispute is one thing," I said, looking directly into the main camera. "But the simple fact is this. Every pipe, every cable, and every trench that brings water and power to this project crosses my private deeded soil and connects to my privately owned infrastructure. They built 15 commercial buildings on land they don't own, and they've been powering it with utilities they've been stealing from me." I paused to let that sink in. "They say I owe them money for development, but the truth is, every time they've flushed a toilet or turned on a light for the past 3 months, They owe rent to me. The lead reporter's eyes went wide. She understood immediately. It wasn't about a cranky homeowner anymore. It was about a brilliant legal trap. The story had completely flipped. Predictably, the HOA's lawyers filed for an emergency injunction the very next day, demanding the court force me to restore public utilities. It was a desperate move, and it failed spectacularly. The judge took one look at my registered filings, which were airtight, and denied their motion in less than 5 minutes. He noted that this was a contract dispute between a development company and a private utility, not a matter of public service. The county, now facing a massive public relations nightmare and the exposure of their own sloppy record-keeping, panicked. They ordered a special emergency HOA meeting to discuss remediation options. It was to be held in the high school auditorium to accommodate the expected crowd, and it would be live-streamed on the county's public access channel. Everyone knew this was it. This was the public showdown. I spent the evening before the meeting in my workshop, not preparing a speech, but calibrating my drone and syncing it to my laptop. The time for talking about paperwork was over. It was time to show them the truth in high definition. The high school auditorium buzzed with the energy of a public spectacle. Every seat was filled. News cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights glowing like predatory eyes. My neighbors, the same ones who had avoided my gaze for weeks, were now watching me with a mixture of curiosity and dawning respect. At the front of the room, Becky Cranston sat at a long table with the remaining HOA board members, her husband Ethan right behind her. She gripped her gavel like a weapon, her face a tight mask of forced composure. She was still trying to project an image of authority, but the panic in her eyes was unmistakable. After a rambling, self-serving opening statement about community values and unforeseen complications, she called me to the podium. She probably expected another argument about deeds and bylaws. She didn't get one. I didn't bring a single piece of paper with me. Instead, I set my laptop on the podium and connected it to the large projector screen behind the stage. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady and amplified by the microphone. Instead of talking about maps, I thought it would be easier just to show you the truth. I clicked a key, and the screen lit up with a crystal-clear aerial view of my island, filmed by my drone just 2 days prior. I started the video. The drone footage glided smoothly from the mainland, across the causeway, and over the skeletal remains of the construction site. Using a simple graphic overlay, I showed the official, undisputed property line from the original county plat map. It appeared on the screen as a bright red line, slicing cleanly between the HOA's territory and my own. Then, I overlaid a second yellow line, the property line from Becky's fraudulent filing. The gasp from the audience was audible as they saw, inarguable, how the fake map had consumed my entire island. But I was just getting started. I played footage of the utility lines, showing their exact path from the main junction box on my mainland property, across my causeway, and spiderwebbing out to each of the 15 illegal buildings. Every foot of that infrastructure was on my side of the red line. Then came the evidence of the shell game. I displayed the incorporation documents for Cranston Development LLC, showing Ethan Cranston as the sole proprietor. Next to it, I put up the construction permits, all filed under his company's name. And finally, I showed the financial disclosures for the HOA, which listed Cranston Development as the primary multi-million-dollar contractor for the community waterfront project. The board members, who had perhaps been duped themselves, started looking at Becky and Ethan with expressions of pure horror. Their faces were pale, sickly. They were realizing they had been used as pawns in the Cranstons' private enrichment scheme. The room was dead silent. Becky started banging her gavel, shouting, "This is out of order! This is a private matter, not a public trial!" But no one was listening to her anymore. And then came the twist I had arranged with my friend Maria. A woman stood up in the third row. It was Maria Ortiz, the county surveyor. She was not a confident public speaker, but her voice was firm and clear when she addressed the county manager, who was seated in the front row. "Sir," she said, "as an officer of the county surveyor's office, I need to go on record. My department has opened a joint investigation with the state prosecutor's office into this matter." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Maria continued, her voice gaining strength. "We have obtained signed and notarized statements from 2 of the foremen from the Cranston Development site. They have testified that Becky Cranston personally instructed them to ignore the original property markers and to begin work based on a new survey she provided. They also confirmed that Ethan Cranston ordered the direct tapping of Mr. Mercer's utility lines. It was a bombshell. The room erupted. Becky was on her feet, screaming now, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He's lying! It's all lies! This man is trying to destroy our community!" Her voice was shrill, hysterical. The mask of control had shattered completely. But before she could say another word, the main doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies walked in, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent hall. They didn't look at the crowd. They walked with a calm, deliberate purpose straight towards the stage. One of them approached Becky Cranston while she was still mid-shout. He said something to her too quiet for the microphone to pick up, and then held out a folded piece of paper, an arrest warrant. The crowd gasped as one. Becky stared at the paper as if it were a snake. She looked at her husband, but Ethan was already inching his chair away from her, his face ashen, trying to become invisible. She looked at the other board members, who were staring at the floor, refusing to meet her eyes. She was utterly, completely alone. As the deputy gently took her arm, her composure finally broke. "You'll regret this, Mercer," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You'll lose everything." The crowd didn't shout back, they just watched. As she was escorted out of the auditorium, a single person started to clap, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with the sound of applause. I just stood at the podium, silent, as the monster they had all feared was finally led away. I hadn't lost anything. I had just taken back what was mine. The fall of the Cranston Empire was faster and more absolute than I could have imagined. Once the racketeering charges were filed, everything else collapsed like a house of cards. Cranston Development was buried under a mountain of lawsuits from contractors they couldn't pay and investors they had duped. Within a month, the company was bankrupt. Ethan Cranston, who had tried so hard to be invisible, found himself tangled in a web of financial crimes that would keep him busy with lawyers for the next decade. The HOA, stripped of its leadership and facing a full-blown revolt from its members, completely capitulated. The remaining board members resigned in disgrace, and a new chastened board was elected, their first order of business being to undo the damage. The county, desperate to scrub the stain of its own negligence, voided every single permit related to the Community Waterfront Project. The final beautiful step was the official order. The 15 unfinished commercial units were to be dismantled and removed at the HOA's expense. Watching the demolition crew arrive was a quiet, profound kind of victory. The same machines that had torn up my land were now being used to heal it, piece by painful piece. It took 2 full weeks to haul away the last of the lumber, concrete, and debris. But when it was done, my island was quiet again. The legal and financial reckoning was swift. The HOA's lawyers, knowing they had no ground to stand on, were eager to settle. The lien on my home was removed with a groveling letter of apology. They agreed to pay for the complete restoration of the island's landscape, a sum determined by a neutral environmental consultant. They also covered every penny I had spent on legal advice and fees. But I had one final condition. Before I signed anything, my new company, Mercer Island Utilities, LLC, would be granted a permanent, legally binding, and exclusive easement to the causeway. The HOA would have no access, no jurisdiction, no say ever again. Their lawyers balked, but I held firm. They could either sign over the causeway or face a multi-million-dollar civil suit from my utility company for damages and lost revenue. They signed. The gate that they had once nailed a violation notice to was now mine, forever. The lock was now on my side of the fence. What surprised me was what happened with my neighbors. One evening, about a week after the demolition was complete, my doorbell rang. It was one of my neighbors, a man I'd only ever exchanged polite waves with. He was holding a small rosebush in a plastic pot. He wouldn't look me in the eye at first. "Mr. Mercer," he said, shuffling his feet, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. We all saw what was happening. We were scared to speak up. It wasn't right." He held out the rosebush. "It's not much, but we thought maybe we could help." The next Saturday, he came back with 4 other families. They brought shovels, bags of fresh soil, and a dozen more rose bushes. They spent the entire day helping me rebuild Eleanor's garden. No one said much about what had happened. We just worked side by side, digging and planting under the warm Florida sun. It was more than an apology. It was an act of quiet solidarity. They were helping me put the soul back into the soil. The settlement from the HOA was substantial. After the restoration costs were covered, there was a significant amount left over. Emily thought I should take a long vacation, see the world. But I knew what I wanted to do with it. I thought about the Cranstons who had tried to build an empire on lies and forged documents. And I thought about my own life, spent learning how to build things that last, things that are honest. I used a portion of the settlement to establish a new local charity, the Mercer Trade Scholarship Fund. It provides grants to young men and women in our county who want to go to trade school to become welders, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. The only condition is that they have to be dedicated to building something honest with their own two hands. It was my way of ensuring that something good and permanent came from all the ugliness. The last scene of this long, strange chapter of my life took place a few months later. The grass on the island had grown back thick and green. The new roses in Eleanor's garden were starting to bloom. Emily and I were sitting on the edge of the rebuilt dock, fishing poles in hand, our lines trailing in the calm, clear water. The air was clean again, filled with the familiar smell of salt and the sound of gulls calling overhead. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was home. Emily looked over at me and smiled. "It's good to have it back, Dad," she said softly. I nodded, watching the gentle motion of the water. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, just being there, soaking in the peace we had fought so hard to reclaim. "You know," I said finally, reeling in my line to check the bait. "They thought they could build over what mattered most." I looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of water and sky. Turns out, they just built the trap that caught them. The island was finally at rest, and so was I. Justice had been served.